thank you all for coming. And if you don't know already, I'll give you a little background. This salon is part of something that we do from time to time. This one's a little bit unusual because normally we do a series of salons, but in this case, this is very much connected with um, John Mill's new book, which is The End of the World, Civilization and Fate. Um, and it's
Best
the
way to
topic
go home.
will explore some of the concepts and ideas that you'll find in the book. But uh, taking a step back to the salons again, this is something that we've been putting on as part of the New School for Existential Psychoanalysis, which is a training program uh, to get certified as a psychoanalyst. It's an online training program that we commenced two, well, we've just begun the third year. Um, so that's been a wonderful training program where students and faculty from around the world get together, talk about philosophy and psychoanalytic practice. And we are very, very lucky to have John as one of the really most important, one of the most important faculty and supervising analysts. And he's plays a very important role in that training program. So just a brief aside, the new school is started its third year. It's also taking new applications for people who are interested in a training program like that. And we're going to be having an open house for people who may have questions about that type of training on December 8th. Um, so um, let me just say about John, you probably all know that he's incredibly accomplished. He is a philosopher, a psychoanalyst, and a clinical psychologist. He's honorary professor in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. He's on faculty in the postgraduate programs in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy at the Gordon Derner School of Psychology at Delphi University. And on faculty, most importantly, he's on faculty and supervising analyst at the New School, as I mentioned. So he's authored and or edited more books than you can imagine, about over 30. So he's very prolific, and it really spans a lot of different topics from philosophy to psychoanalysis, and even within psychoanalysis, John is especially diverse, being very well versed in the world of Jung as well as Freud and relational psychoanalysis, and can talk to you about pretty much anything. So today, I'm very excited to hear John's discussion about the end of the world and how perhaps it may relate to an unconscious collective death wish, I think. All right, John, thanks so much.
Thank you, James, for the gracious intro. Um, I'd appreciate it if everybody can mute themselves while I'm talking. And I plan for about a 30-minute blab, and then we can have an hour or so discussion, I hope. So I really appreciate everybody coming out, particularly on their Saturday. And please forgive me, I'm overcoming a cold after I got COVID again. So uh, bear with me, but I thank you again. We begin our story with witnessing a crime. We see it happening, but nobody intervenes. It just happens and keeps on happening as some indifferent occurrence where everyone says, "It's not my problem." We find ourselves as bystanders, hoping others will intercede, but no one wants to get their hand dirty. Citizens are frozen. Police walk by. Not even government officials care that a murder is being committed. World collectives become onlookers who accept no responsibility, let alone an obligation to act. We are passers-by to ecocide. We're facing a planetary ecological crisis due to global warming, despoliation of our natural resources, mass-scale industrial pollution, desertification, deforestation, widespread collapse of ecosystems, and extreme climate change. World overpopulation is nearing a record tipping point where food and water scarcity will bring about more famine, drought, pestilence, and death. Global catastrophic hazards have escalated due to the environmental crisis. Encroachment by man, destabilized markets, hegemonic politics, the ubiquitous dread of nuclear war, terrorism, infectious diseases, techno-nihilism, and psychological self-interest driving everything from vain desire to the local economy and international relations, not to mention the anathema of evil, abuse, trauma, greed, and the psychopathology of everyday life. Our recalcitrant dependency on fossil fuels is gradually suffocating the planet. Greenhouse warming, climate catastrophes, and aberrant weather phenomenon occur every day throughout the globe, and yet we do very little to mitigate it, let alone reverse its course. Moreover, we have caused the Anthropocene. Despite the fact that we see the ruin with our own eyes and do practically nothing to mitigate the ecological crisis, world masses have adopted a global bystander effect, where denial and abnegation of social responsibility lie at its very core. Regardless of the degree of gravity we assign to these calculated risks imperiling our existence, we cannot ignore the ominous threat of planetary extinction unless humanity unites in moral preventative action. My argument is that we are hypnotized by a global bystander effect as we aloofly watch the Earth slowly being destroyed. Like a cigarette addict, we know it's bad for us, but we don't want to kick the habit, even as our lungs are filled with smoke and tar. What are some possible reasons for this apathetic phenomenon? And why do we continue to allow ourselves to be idle bystanders to our climate emergency? Here on Earth, we're destroying the planet. This is an irrefutable empirical fact. Greenhouse warming, climate catastrophes, and aberrant weather phenomena occur every day throughout the globe, and yet we do very little to prevent it, let alone reverse its course. Moreover, what we have caused this. I'm repeating myself because I think it's important. Despite the fact that we see the ruin with our own eyes and do practically nothing, world masses have adopted this collective bystander syndrome, where denial and abnegation of responsibility is at its core. Such lethargy, placidness, and unwillingness to act on a global scale are tantamount to moral transgression. Although many conscientious and concerned bystanders are wielding protests against rampant ecological despoliation and organizing civil disobedience campaigns, such as the youth climate change and Extinction Rebellion movements, also Stop Oil. Many global citizens, particularly in the developed world, are simply watching or idly strolling by as our planet is sluggishly being destroyed from collective inactivity to prevent, subvert, and rehabilitate our dying Mother Earth. Such bystander apathy pluralistic ignorance and diffusion of responsibility are psychological phenomena that are recalcitrant to reason. Like with the homeless and vagabonds on the streets, we have largely become spectators, passively observing the deterioration of the Earth's biosphere without so much as lifting a finger to help. We just watch, waiting for someone else to jump in and fix things. What explains such lassitude? Whether in passivity or pushback, the collective bystander effect serves as an existential threat to humanity. This disturbing global phenomenon is evident from the fact that much of world citizenship, including all national governing leaders in every civil country, has sound scientific knowledge of our planetary plight, where there is no ambiguity with regards to the severity of our ecological emergency and the dangerous consequences that befall us. The world watches and looks on, whether helplessly, indifferently, or interpassively, as the impending death of Gaia is slowly succumbing to preventable inaction. Although many claim to be ignorant of climatology and the earth sciences, even adopting skeptical and dismissive attitudes toward the validity claims made by natural scientists who study such matters for a living every day, hundreds of thousands of people, we cannot deny empirical facts without succumbing to delusion. When large numbers of people are less likely to react to emergencies to help victims and people in distress, hence eschewing any personal responsibility, then how do we understand this global bystander phenomenon when it involves billions of people? It would be fallacious and disingenuous to deny knowledge or assume pluralistic ignorance of our ecological emergency when the leading scientific authorities, research and academic institutions, private industry, policy analysts, economists, world government agencies, and international climate and earth science advocacy groups all plead the world masses to curb our carbon emissions and turn to more environmentally friendly forms of renewable energy in order to subvert our portentous catastrophe. The ecological apocalypse is looming before our very eyes, yet we're unwilling or unable to overcome the diffusion. How do we make sense of this global bystander disorder? Why do world collectives turn a blind eye to the common sense reality that lies before them? Is this simply due to denial or the unconscious illusion of constancy? Despite the fact that we need to take very seriously the possibility that we may be on the verge of human extinction if we do not take immediate collective global action, individuals in solitude and in social masses simply are not contemplating our perilous future with any foresight. There may be many reasons for this, from cognitive or information overload, collective self-deception or bad faith, mauvaise foi, optimistic overconfidence or blind faith in the future, failure to consider futurity in terms of its possibilities and probabilities, underestimation of the stakes involved, overestimation of the predictability of the past, while underestimating the unknowns of the future, ignoring the need for future preparation without the benefit of hindsight, or simply looking to others to provide evidence for why we should act while trying to appear poised and unflustered as a means of saving face, covering over shame or ignorance, and or to project the tacit conviction that others are enveloped in a naive, reactionary defense. Perhaps a simple economy of splitting and emotional detachment is at play, or some grandiose hubris governing egotistical narcissism that opines, quote, "We are the center of all things," hence hardly giving a passing thought to a world greater than us. May I further suggest it is because it is simply too big of a problem to fully understand, let alone fix. And even when there is sufficient understanding of the problem, individual action alone can do nothing to ameliorate it. Solutions require collective actions on a mass scale. Until this happens, we will remain bystanders, witnessing our gradual deterioration due to powerlessness and ennui. When collective societies are under the influence or dominion of state power, it becomes cognitively reflexive, hence natural, to turn over responsibility and accountability to society or one's nation to remedy, as that is what citizens come to expect from their government, leaders, or political patriarchy, conditioned by paternal transference. It is also too complex of an issue for any one person or group of people to fully mend, let alone do something about reversing a worldwide phenomenon. All of humanity's psychological defenses get mobilized from disavowal, like, yes, I know, but dissociation, rationalization, intellectualization, and so on when confronting such a massive conundrum. How do we just shut off the lights, stop driving to work, and using fuel when the world revolves around every form of energy we rely on for our livelihoods and survival? By definition, this makes it a systemic structural issue that involves the agreement and cooperation of greater societal collectives, willing to be ideologically unified and committed to concrete change through resolute and deliberate action. But given human nature and the competing array of desires, emotions, ideology, and psychological complexes that constitute the political animal, can we really expect a global meeting of minds that will end in consensus and united action? Or will want, greed, politics, capital, and military strategy ensure that such collective valuation practices remain only a fantasy? Individuals, communities, and even whole nations who adopt environmentally conscientious practices, such as limiting the consumption of fossil fuels, stop having so many children, adopt green practices using renewable energies, such as wind and solar power, and alternative technologies like electronic automobiles and geothermal sources of heat and cooling systems in order to reduce their carbon footprints and so forth, will virtually make no difference in the grander scheme of the Earth's biosphere. Although such efforts are noble, it will take a union of nations committed to concrete change on a worldwide scale. And how would this be accomplished without state intervention? Moreover, how could it be enforceable given that national self-interest governs all policy in every nation state? And even if this were for our own good and was enforceable, Would this not violate the very principles of liberty, democracy, and distributive justice? And what will happen when the Earth becomes too overpopulated, as the projected growth in scientific evidence suggests, with billions more people to feed, burning more and more fossil fuels? Our planetary sweatsuit is bound to become one big unbearable sauna. More people, more warming, less food, less water, less land, less money. Here we have a perfect formula for death. We are witnessing our planet slowly disintegrate as devastated economies, social implosions, and anarchy during the pandemic have brought us to our knees. Why do we allow obscene disparities in wealth and social divisions to proliferate, remain silent about the prevalence of psychopathy in politics and globalized capitalism, and bow to the imbalances of power that could ultimately bring about our own extinction? It's only on the condition that we are under the unconscious spell of a compulsion to destroy ourselves. The exploitation from unbridled capitalism only benefits the rich, while much of the world population suffers. As politicians think about their re-election campaigns, governments are preoccupied with their military optics and gross national products rather than the environment. As we watch the desolation of being alongside our geopolitical tensions, the nuclear bombast, terror, and racial, gender, education, and healthcare inequity, overpopulation and infectious diseases of the future will only bring about more economic collapse, mental illness, culture wars, and crippled societies left to scrounge in the dirt. The range of global threats invites calls to action that seem improbable to ignore, but we can and do ignore them, for the world remains unconscious of our global predicament. Inertia and idleness in the service of dissociation and disavowal becomes an unconscious strategy to protect us from the very thing we are bringing about. Humanity is guilty of such inaction, for turning a blind eye, hence unwilling to see, and for sticking its head in the sand. We need to awaken a new ethic of responsibility to the planet, where empathy, solidarity, and becoming better global citizens in the service of the common good will lead to a better demos and polis. For this reason, the time has come to critically examine those elements of the human psyche that defeat efforts to mitigate our looming catastrophe. While we continue sleepwalking through our anesthetized states of moral torpor, denial and self-delusion impair our capacity to collectively rise to the occasion. The question becomes, will our collective unconscious death wish bring about our demise? Most psychoanalysts dismiss the notion of a death drive, or Todestrieb, as an innately internal human impulse that manifests itself as destruction, including our own, realized through many circuitous paths. I very much believe this is an ontological force in the mind, and it's happening now, yet on a metaphysical collective scale. We may call this the Omega principle, the power of the negative that is unconsciously compelled toward repetition compulsion, to seek a return, perhaps to origin, the recapitulation of tensionlessness, whether as peace or as heaven. In other words, the pulsion to exterminate suffering, the cessation of our undying pain. If there is such a thing as a collective psyche, namely the universality of human desire expressed through all its social and cultural appearances, then we cannot escape the teleology of the negative propelling the dialectical manifestations of both creative potencies amongst the mist of their destruction. This ceaseless dynamic of opposition, whether in the cosmic principle of strife in Hesiod and Heraclitus, the eternally living fire, ion that plays, builds up, then destroys, to Schelling's dark ground of spirit as the eternal essence, the source of things driving the ages of the world. The destructive impulse in Nietzsche's Dionysian aesthetic to the eschaton, the end, the chaos before creation. From ashes to ashes, dust to dust. This brings me to ask, are we on the brink of extinction? Are we living in the end times? Will there be an eschatological apocalypse? Will there be a nuclear holocaust? Will new plagues ravage the world? Will there be future dystopias where the planet is a miserable place to live, or life merely becomes surviving perennial hardship? Or will we transform these doomsday scenarios through visionary praxis, prevention, invention, intervention, and determinate grit? Could the future be replete with flourishing ecologies, post-human or otherwise, sustainment, universal equity initiatives, global justice, New World Order Enlightenment paradigms, and global egalitarian values adopted by all? Or will we have mass ecological plunder, decay, and biodiversity loss that wreaks havoc on our future environments? Will we have a lawless world governed by widespread injustice that has undergone nuclear war and terror, diasporas and mass migrations, widening disparities that have led to global poverty, where the elite and wealthy run the world, or are governed by totalitarian dictators, despots, and autocrats who rule with iron tyrannical gloves? Or will there be ecological healing, sustainability, amelioration of environmental hazards, where we live in a globalized ethical world that recognizes and treats all of humanity as equal citizens of the cosmos, meaning cosmopolitans, where there's a distribution, a fair distribution of wealth, goods, and services, equity and a living wage for all, even a world central bank or post-capitalistic system that makes all economies interrelated and ontically interconnected to every human being on the planet. Will our future leaders gravitate toward this cosmopolitan vision of cooperative global partnership, harmonization, and interdependent unity of social collectives under the humanistic rubric of agape? What will the future of education, training, and information exchange in the advanced age of science and technology look like? Will it remain dominated by private for-profit industry, where there is a pronounced inequality in opportunity, means, and funding, even occlusive or prohibitive of those who have no? Or will education and vocational training be state-controlled at no cost, where academics and instruction are an interdependent, valued commodity to society? Will technology designs and securities evolve to regulate dual-use capacities, where ethical programming and nano-manufacturing of machines, AI devices, and superintelligences are safe and non-threatening through post-technical revolutions? Or will dual-use techniques succumb to dysregulation, unmodulation, and unsafe production and distribution that could lead to a techno-apocalypse? Worldviews are just as polarized. Schopenhauerian pessimism rings its bell with widespread bystander apathy, nihilistic outlooks, belief in predetermined fate or fatalism, external locus of control, loss of freedom, and learned helplessness that leads to social splitting, division, fracturing, decay, and anarchy. The more optimistic sectarian champions the vision of transglobal egalitarianism, where there is a welcoming world hospitality view of valuing plurality and difference that advocates individual agency, social liberty, and collective ethical and political activism oriented toward a more harmonized, just, and holistic republic. This is where the myth of Gaia emerges from the ashes of a suffocating sickness, where overheating, deterioration, and ecocide are evaded for a foresight narrative of nurturance, health, and flourishment. It is up to us to choose how we should act. We must not delude ourselves, though, in our dissociative denial or global disavowal of the present hazards looming before us, yet disconnected from our consciousness, as if we can crudely discount the real through a form of infantile, omnipotent narcissism. The destruction of our planet at our own hands reflects the death drive at its apex, where a psychotic negation of reality has taken hold of world masses. Here we may observe an undercurrent of the shadow, a primordial force drawing us back into darkness, into the chthonic austerity of nothingness, the netherworld of death. The collective unconscious shadow of humanity is bellowing through its own self-destructive manifestations, what we must engage and abate before it's too late. The end of civilization is not a preordained fatalism, but will rather be an imprudent consequence of our cavalier, dismissive hubris, of our own unconscious tendencies towards self-eradication. That is, humanity's death wish that will cause our extinction if we don't wake up from our dream world and stop it from becoming real. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was, I think it was very evocative, I think for sure, because we're all, what could grab anyone's attention more than potential annihilation? So, um, yeah, one thing I'd love to open it up in a moment, but one thing I wanted to ask about, John, is this all leads to the death wish, the idea that we end up uh ignoring and all of these things ultimately because of an unconscious death wish. And you were mentioning that many psychologists don't believe in an innate death wish. Um, I was wondering if you could say something about what uh, if you have any ideas of where that death wish kind of comes from, or what's the nature of it. Um,
Well, where do I begin? If the question becomes whether or not there's a destructive principle in the psyche, and how does the destructive principle manifest itself? Certainly, on some level, um, we can't ignore the fact that we are saturated by human aggression every day in some form throughout the globe. Now, one could say, well, that's human aggression. It's not the same as a compulsion toward death. Um, one one could, finagle their way out of the fact that human aggression is just innate, and there really isn't something that is a compulsory that brings about one's own self-destructive states. But let's look at our clinical experiences with people. People come in, of course, this is a little dislocated from more of a normative non-clinical population, but I would argue that the normative um, non-clinical population is also saturated in pathos or suffering, and they just deal with it in their own way. So anything from extreme forms of mental illness, to normative ways that people are struggling with depression, anxiety, addictions, relationship, issues, or they sabotage their relationships with people, are all very, self-destructive. They don't lead to flourishing, and people are in many ways aware of it. They're aware that this is bad for them. They continue patterns. They don't want to give up, as Lacan would say, their jouissance, their excessive enjoyment in excess. And when we flirt with that, we can bring about our own self-harm. So if we see that in our own patients, we see that in society, we see that in our private lives, why wouldn't we apply that more globally, meaning in societies? Like, why is it that we continue to kill each other? Why is it that we see every single continent, inhabitable continent, is engaged in war, military conflict, with the intent of hateful destruction of the other? It hasn't gone away. Um, maybe maybe it is ameliorated over the times, as Steven Pinker would tell us with his statistical analysis, uh, of how we become less aggressive people. But we're still sadistic bastards deep down. and we see it in every conceivable form, from the nursery to the playground. You'll see. I mean, I'll give you numerous examples from my life, but I'll spare you mine. So anyway, this is where I'm coming from. I think that there's something universal about a destructive principle, and that it is a dialectical tension with its opposite, to not destroy, to not succumb to these negative dialectics. But if we look at certain philosophical metaphysical systems, I mean, the negative is absolutely an essential ingredient that brings about a positive change. It's a constructive element in its destruction, and so we can't speak of one desire or drive without evoking the other. That's just the dialectical nature of our psyches.
Yeah, you made me think, John. I just was reminded it's not just you're pointing to the aggression, but also, there's the death wish in ourselves. And speaking of apocalypses, we all remember how popular zombie movies were very recently. It's zombie apocalypses. And if you ever talk to someone who loves zombie movies, you do kind of get this sense that, oh yeah, the world would be over, and then I'd be free to just, just like not worry about all that shit. It's not just a scary movie, it's a fantasy. That I want the world to be over, because fuck all this shit.
Yeah, and, actually, that's a good point, because it also mirrors the notion of all the major eschatologies that exist. That the notion of an eschatology is to bring about the end, but the bringing about of an ending, it's an absolute destruction of the world as it is, and it cannot be regenerated once it's degenerated. So the fantasy is a return to the original bliss. It's a return to the bosom of God. It is a recapitulation of perfection, and it only is accomplished on the condition that everything must be destroyed. Now, when you put that in the context of radical fundamental religious fanaticism, this is a reality. It's not a fantasy. We need to bring about. We are not only that, we are calling as a mission to bring this about. And this is what's one of the most scariest elements. To what degree will this be the catalyst to the next world war that we will encounter? Someone's going to do something stupid. If you have no if you have something to gain by annihilating societies or masses, meaning that I'm going to be returned to a paradise with God. And many people believe in this. I think it's quite delusional, psychotic state, but nevertheless, they were conditioned this way. That is scary. But it's not, it's in all the main monotheisms. I mean, you have in Judea, Christian, and Islamic. It's not just one. Um, but it's a scary proposition given what's going on in the Middle East right now. We should not negate or deny or disavow the importance of what's happening in our world right now.
Mm. Uh, Thank you. Well, I don't want to take up too much. I'm sure everyone has a lot of thoughts and questions. So feel free to just jump right in, or once we get started, I'll try to track if you put your hand up. But everyone is muted. So, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you, and it's great. I'm very grateful for this, and um, I have a question. Is there a collective death drive, and can there be a dialectical tension to emancipate us from perpetual fetishistic disavowal? Does Lacan's notion of the big other correlate to um, the notion of the big deceiver manifested in conspiracy theories?
Well, Jonathan, that's a lot to unpack. So I will plead ignorance here if I can even address one element of it. So, you know, is there a big collective death drive that's operative in in world psyche? Um, well, I think that I'd like to not hypothesize or make make this collective psyche an anthropos in the sky. Um, I would look at it more in terms of that all human beings have their own psyche, and we participate of a collective of social beings. So there are many universals to the psyche that are, I think, operative in all of us, regardless of time, space, gender, location, where we came from. There are many universals that people don't like to talk about these days, such as the existence of the unconscious, or the existence of consciousness, the existence of desire and defense and transference and things like this. Um, denial is denial no matter what is being denied. So that's a universal. Of course, it manifests itself in particularities, in contexts, in the individual personality that is embedded within a social ontology, and that social ontology is certainly affected by the language of that culture, its historicity, um, not to mention the cultural variances that take place. So that's what I would say is what I talk about when I talk about a collective psyche. It's universality that's common to all people, even though we can never be, we can never collapse our individual lived experiences or phenomenology into some kind of category that captures that. So if we start on that preface, I don't want to start on the preface of a collective mind or cosmopsychism or something like that. Even though we could do that, I just don't want to do that here. Um, so starting with that definition, do I think there are destructive elements in all human beings? Yes, of course, I do. Now you can call them whatever you like, the dialectic between Eros and Thanatos. You can call them life and death. You can call them, a destructive principle that's in relation to an affirmative principle. But I also think that, looking at the complexities of dialectics within dialectics, um, is not a simple, matter. Um, Even right here, I'm aware of that most people probably don't think like that. But if I'm trying to simplify it, I'm trying to simplify in the senses that we all have to deal with inner contradictions. We have nothing but inner oppositions that are at play with one another. And we're trying to find ways of mediating, integrating, unifying, and neutralizing these oppositional forces. Um, when good things don't go right, when wishes are frustrated, when we are met with real traumas from external world that impacts us, then these self-preservative, drives that I'm sure evolution are evolutionarily informed kick into play. If anybody's been in a dangerous situation, you don't think about what you do. You just, nature takes over. And yeah, I mean, like, you could see, I mean, I could potentially imagine that any of us if we were put in really compromising positions, might act entirely different from our moral self-conscious identities. So, um, like I got hit as a pedestrian walking in a parking lot, and all of a sudden the guy came out of the car. I was thrown off his hood, but luckily, um, having spent many years training in my younger days as a martial artist, my body just kicked in, and with an Aikido roll, I just rolled off on the ground on my back, kept my head up, and I just came off that concrete like a psychotic lunatic ready to kill. And,
That's
and
awesome.
then it took somebody to come up and realize that I'm out of my head. And the guy who comes up from his car, it looks so sorry that I reconstitute, and I'm able to not, calm down. So, who knows what's in us? Uh,
Mhm.
I think, this is something that we don't just think of what people who are suffering every day, like our friend here in Lebanon. What would the society be like? I mean, we'd have an entirely different reality. But Jonathan, I'm sorry, I'm blabbing. Getting back to the big other, and conspiracy theories. I mean, what is the big other? What is the big other of the other, or the other's big other? I mean, is it God, or does God have a God that's watching it? Uh, so the Lacanian schemes are fun to play with. Like Zizek is just brilliant at it. Um,
Yeah. Or Lenka Zupancic, she wrote that book Disavowal recently. It's very interesting, talking about like how society has that fetishistic disavowal towards things that even though they may realize it for what it is, they'll deny it anyways. Like it's like maybe you mentioned about eschatological aspects, and it's like we're looking in the abyss, and we recognize the abyss, but we're kind of like trying to deny it anyways.
yes, I mean, I'm just as guilty. I'm aware of it. What can I do? I can do little. I try to do my best. I'm trying to raise awareness. In my own way, this is my, I don't know, form of political activism. It's also a psychological revolt. It's it's a plea to police. I hope I can talk to people who think my way, and we can do something. Um, but speaking of the big other and the conspiracy theory, we need the big other out there. Meaning we need we need these leaders to take a look at this issue. Again, this year, the hottest on record that's ever been recorded. Um, so and then the climate denialists are funny. I don't understand them. Like it's a hoax. I mean, how do you even just talk? Did you read anything? I spent 20 years reading this stuff before I finished this book. Well, what have you read? I'm just, if you get engaged in that level, it's like you'll see every element of defense that tries to maneuver around it. Um, it's hard to accept. So anyway, that's my attempt, Jonathan.
Wow. Yeah. No. Thank
Conspiracy.
you so much, Dr. Mills. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, Elam, like to go next?
Yeah, I just had some thoughts. I was thinking about like, will humanity survive? And lately, just watching what's been going around in the world, um, I'm thinking we need some help. Um, so I know this is a slippery slope. I have the fantasies sometimes of there being in the future maybe some like humanistic geneticists who can like alter the human gene code so that like the ontological structure isn't changed, but like the firmware is adjusted a little bit. So like maybe like the switch to paranoid schizoid position, like the ease of that is like reduced by like 3 times, like 300% or something. Like that'd make a huge difference. Like we would still have it, but so I just like to play in my fantasy, like I don't know, maybe.
Well, you need to write a screenplay. Because yeah, this is what James is talking about, the dystopian, futuristic movies and novels and that whole genre of, whatever it be, zombie apocalypse. There's some pleasure in watching the fantasy of the future after it's been eradicated, and come what would flourish after that, a new beginning. um but the note, and I admit I watch these things too. Yeah, I do. Not the of zombie stuff. That's, yeah, yeah. It's got to have a supernatural, edge to it, something futuristic, sci-fi, and real. I hate Hollywood shit. But Elam, the thought that, the futurists who talk about, colonizing the galaxies, doesn't that sound like a complete fantasy? Why would we, burn all this money and resources in a future fantasy, uh, rather than dump those resources in trying to deal with things right now? It's like an escape hatch. Who comes up with this stuff? I mean, and they're serious, like Elon Musk. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, an autistic mind is looking for solutions, and getting rid of things currently is about, looking at the future, and I'll give him credit for that. Um, but who in their right mind would allow anyone to put some mechanism in my brain, or change my biologies? Um, I guess I'd have to wait to see. Like, I'm waiting to see if Ozempic works. Maybe it will work for me, but I was told if I take it, I can't eat. I like to eat and I like to drink, so I think I'll just self-destruct instead.
I have something I liked what you were saying about the kind of evolutionary drives, and maybe I approach this very practically. My fantasy, if we're going to talk through that lens, is that I see the human race as we're all in a rat maze and like rodents running, and there'll be like a stream of rodents that are running down the southwest end or something, and they'll figure something out, and there'll be great losses. But this is the sort of this idea that some kind of leap will occur, but there'll be great costs. And I think of like, do we have this somewhat programmed in us, through this sort of opposite light and shadow and destruction and creation, and that is in fact a very significant part of how I think humans think and exist. And so this way of looking at it for me, I really come back to sort of like community organizing, trying to get creative within the local unit, etc. Even though it's not reflected in any way by the government or big organizations and the compromised institutions, and that it really are really just kind of bloodsucking at this point. It really feels like that. I'd just be interested in just, adding that to the mix of and hearing people in a more looser form around this. I feel like I get sort of caught up in trying to figure out the theory and using the analytic lens for this and the existential lens for that. And it's like, what do people feel? What are we feeling?
Yeah, no, very, very good points, Jan. mean, what else can we do
Yeah.
other than try to find a community of people that we have shared values with? If we can get other people to see what we value and to take some kind of stand on it. Every time I have a talk about this stuff, I don't know the solution. I mean, I literally don't. I don't.
Yeah.
I'm going to be pretentious about it. I'm unable to resolve it. And
I
so,
feel
what would it take? I think it's going to just take people to come out and vote certain leaders into office and get rid of those. There has to be compromises. There's never, in life, everything's a compromise. If it's dialectically, motivated, you don't get one side winning over the other. You have to find some kind of integration or synthesis or compromise or salute of some form. And that's more or less, I think, what we see in human nature, and we see it in politics. Just takes on different, over time. We see swings, like swings of the pendulum.
John, can I? Thanks very much for very, very evocative, as James has said, a very evocative talk. And I feel probably more pessimistic than you do, believe it or not. And one reason is that I'm not sure, and I'm very interested in your response to this. I'm not sure that there is a we. If you think of even in the United States, there's been, there's 51 point something or other percent who want one side, and 49 want the other, and they hate each other. And there's a lot of, hate, as you were saying, a lot of non-cooperation and polarization and blaming other people and all the psychoanalytic things of projection and gaslighting of various sorts that happens even in the United States. But then when you think of other countries like China and what they're contributing towards, say, global emissions, for example, or and also, the terrible oppression they have of so many Uyghurs and ordinary people in China, and the start of the possibility of them going and taking over Taiwan, and then you've got the Middle East issues and so on. And I think of, in the last century, we had the idea of the League of Nations that would, bring about eternal peace, after the war to end all wars of the First World War. And then we have the United Nations, which again was never again, and that sure hasn't been terribly successful. So, and so on and so on. And then when you look at the fact that say China and India put out huge amounts of emissions and so on, and they're not going to call themselves developing countries, so they're not going to succumb to this thing. They're only interested in their own interests, or the Communist Party of China's interests anyway. You've got that kind of problem. So I don't know how you get around that. The only thing I can think of actually is nuclear energy as being an answer to some of these issues. And in the country I live in Australia, we've got some kind of weird block among quite a few people, listening so, against about having any nuclear reactors, producing energy in Australia. But I know I think there are 38 countries which do use nuclear, including the United States and Canada, of course, and a lot of Europe, which do use nuclear. And I'm wondering if that's, something that, I mean, China is an example of that too. They use the nuclear as well as the fossil fuel. So I wonder if that's, a positive way out. But I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of scientists are certainly making strong arguments for why it's a cleaner form of energy, it's more efficient, it's less damaging. It just the term, I think, psychologically conjures up the paranoid position. Yeah, and the bombs that have been dropped, Manhattan Project and things like that. But if you set that aside, um, I'm thinking of James Lovelock, the guy who invented the microwave. The Gaia hypothesis. Scientist, certainly advocated for that in his books. But yeah, we'll have to see. I mean, uh, I don't pretend to speak outside of my area of expertise, but do you think that Israel and the U.S. is going to allow Iran to develop its nuclear capabilities now? Not since they revealed the recent assassination plot against Trump. I mean, the country would benefit, of course, if it had access to water, um, and to nuclear clean energies. But I'm just a pessimist. This is not looking good. What's happening right now in our life.
One
Sorry.
one small thing I'd just say about that with Iran is that they can produce, they're allowed to do up to whatever it is, 60%. But the problem is, the thing is, they aren't up to the nuclear threshold, and whether that can be policed in theory, but I don't know.
Well, before going down further that way, I just want to make sure we do get to Jeremy and Robert who have their hands up. So Jeremy, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks for the presentation. I feel myself sweating as you went through it. My question for you is about the role of, and then I'll say like just a couple of sentences after it. The role of parenting and child raising or child rearing, in the words of the late psychoanalyst Alice Miller. My own sense is that the deepest heartbreak in my own, looking at my own life and examining why I make the decisions that I made or have in the past, the deepest heartbreak, the thing that the desire for annihilation or numbing out and disappearing and starting over came from, is the incredible heartbreak of lovelessness in childhood. And it seems to me that we've been in thousands of years of some version of that, and that we're sort of still in that cycle. Even here, I think it's still legal, for instance, in the United States to spank, which is just coded word for beating a child, including with their clothes off. I'm partial in this sense to the work of Riane Eisler, who's talked about dominator societies versus partnership societies, and pointed to some evidence in Neolithic and Paleolithic culture of cultures that did it differently, where there was partnership, maybe less violence, less of a drive toward this annihilation, destruction. So I'm just curious how you think about, in your clinical work and in your philosophy, about what role is the way we treat children playing in our inability to do different, which I think the that experience for children is like one of the root causes of the inability to act and act justly and act with love and compassion. Thanks.
No, excellent points, Jeremy. Well, you know, my first clinical book was called Treating Attachment Pathology. And so I do think that majority of people who suffer in the world, you know, have attachment deficits. It's affected the structural integrity of their personality formation. And of course, this happens as repetitions of developmental traumas. And if they are transgenerationally transmitted, you just perpetuate these cycles. But at the same time, it's very difficult. I mean, like there's one thing to have a disorder versus a deficit versus a vulnerability. I think we all certainly have vulnerabilities, there's no question. And they condition the way we relate to others. They condition the way, you know, whether it be based upon our familial interactions early on to the way we connect, you know, emotionally or bond with our parents, our, you know, immediate, you know, siblings and people in our environments. It conditions the way we enter the world. So it's no surprise that, you know, many people who come into the consulting room are scarred by all kinds of developmental traumas. I mean, why are we in the helping profession? Duh. So we need to have some compassion about that people have suffered. They've been, you know, exposed to this and try to overcome it. Overcome it throughout their life, through their education, through love, through empathy, through compassion. It's a profoundly personal struggle. Ultimately, I think everything is.
Absolutely.
But Jeremy, I definitely think you're onto something. So if people haven't, if they haven't had an awakening of, or even being taught in the home, in school, to be attentive to other people, to be present to others, to acknowledge that they exist, that they have needs just like you do, they have conflicts like you do, and that you're attuned, just like a good therapist. We shouldn't be shocked that most people have these kind of deficits in interpersonal relatedness, and this probably is the foundation for much of the perpetual suffering that we see. But not all. I mean, you know, education, opportunities, you know, class differences, disparities, a number of things that would go into creating better, healthier environments are sadly lacking. You know, the mere fact that most relationships split up. I mean, apparently that's a sound statistical fact. And you know, all kids are coming from split families, blended families, and they have to deal with these losses with parents. It's part of the human tragedy. I hope that addressed some of your concerns.
Robert, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, James, for doing this seminar, and thank you, John, very much for a very, very thoughtful and very thought-provoking talk. Of course, this is a thing that really should be on everybody's mind. I just wanted to say that I was a combat helicopter pilot in the Vietnam War, and I came kind of face to face with what you called Thanatos, the god of death, not only on the battlefield, but I discovered that energy in myself that had been evoked in me through the military training and the military experience. And I had to go through a whole process of evoking a transformation of that to find a better balance in myself between Thanatos and Eros, that dichotomy that you were talking about. So it's as you said, it's a very personal experience that people have to go through. But I think there are ways to evoke that on a societal and virtually a universal societal level. But the answers to that remain to be found. Finding that balance between Eros and Thanatos within oneself.
Well, thanks, Robert, for that. I know your second life has been as a teacher, as an educator. So, and you know, obviously, if we didn't have those professions, we wouldn't be initiated into ideas and contemplate what would be a good way to live life. The other thing that came to mind was, I mean, how do you, I mean, among the Jungians here, I mean, this is what individuation's about.
Exactly.
And
I really appreciate what Jeremy had to say about children and raising children and education and all of that. That's very important.
Eric. Yeah. And you're muted, Eric, so you just need to unmute yourself there.
And I also appreciated what you said, Jeremy, and I'm reminded of Freud's comment about consciousness. You know, it's not much, but it's all we have. And I would say that about this situation, that compassion and love is what you were talking about, and you mentioned, John, seems whether it's going to make any difference or not, on an individual level, it does make a difference to our little worlds. And your talk, John, was great. You reminded me of two great minds. One is Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. And the question you're raising is, I mean, since everything that is began sometime and it's going to end sometime, but the question is there an aim toward that end? And that I'm not sure about. At some point, we all probably would prefer to die than go on living, given I'm now 80 years old. So, and the other person is Noam Chomsky's little YouTube chat on the end of organized civilization. I mean, that talk just kept coming back to me as you spoke. So thank you. These things seems like they're always on all our minds, and what little things we can do about it is the question.
well, yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, I mean, all we need is love.
And there ain't enough of it.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask for some comments on this as well. I mean, I think of, you know, we're getting increasingly alienated from each other, young people particularly. And you know, these are not like global statements. It's more just, you know, I think some can all agree to that part. And I think of, you know, encounter groups, group therapy, places where there is a sort of, I mean, I think it's a very poignant piece about, you know, how do we attach and individuate with our children with us, and child abuse and so on. But I mean, where can we practice? Where can we bring people to do this? And I think group therapy, you know, is a very viable option to really awaken that. So what are people thinking about that, or particularly
some of the
Yeah.
reminding me of someone asked Freud at one point, how can we prevent war? Is there a way we could prevent war? And he said he doesn't think it could be prevented, only mitigated. Because like some of the stuff is like, can you get to the point where there's not a destructive component in people? Can you get to the point where there's not depression in people, where there's not, there's not some people who look at those like zombie movies and look at them longingly, like, oh yeah, if only zombies were to take over, and then I'd have to just, there'd be no love to hope for, to feel brokenhearted about. There'd only be, fighting for your life. There's always going to be some people who love that stuff. But yeah, that's what makes me think of. John, would you like to say something to that? And then we'll probably have to wrap up after that.
Yeah, well, yeah, Janet, I think group processes is what brings people together, even if they disagree. There's some kind of community about wanting to reach out, whether it be in the therapy, whether it be therapeutically, or whether it be in education or any type of special interest groups. People are attracted to similar values and ideals. So yeah, very much. I think that's a healing space.
Let's get the AGPA in here. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, John, so much, and thank all of you so much for coming. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I did just want to mention again that well, I mentioned already that if anyone's looking for training, we have an open house in December. And one thing to mention, February 1st in San Francisco, we're going to have an in-person salon, and we may have try to videotape that to make that available for you guys also online. But if you're in the area or can come to the area, a lot of us will be here, and we'll have a big party, and it's going to be about ketamine-assisted psychotherapy from one of our students at the new school, alumni at the new school will be putting that on, but we're also going to have a party, and it'll be fun. So if you can't make it, we'll Zoom you in. But thank you again, John, and thanks everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
thanks, James and John, for all you're doing for us.
Oh, thanks, Eric. I really
Yeah.
appreciate
Nice to see you, Brooke.
Thank you.
Oh, good to see you, Dr. Mills. I look forward to your book. Thank you.
Oh, good to
This is
see you,
really
Brooke.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I really, really enjoyed this talk. So thank you both so much for hosting, making it possible. Yeah.
Oh, glad you enjoyed it. Good to see you again.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Until next time.
Okay, until next time.
Bye.